Hello there. I am glad you could be here today. We are in the book of First Kings, starting in chapter 11. And with the past couple of lessons that we've had, you may remember we were talking about King Solomon, and there was a little bit of uneasiness in those lessons because while we found that he was being blessed by God, there seemed to be some things about him that just weren't right. Like he did not have his whole heart committed to God. And we find in these chapters that that is exactly the problem. And part of it comes out of the fact that he didn't have just one wife or two wives. More than one is considered not proper. In those days, a king or a powerful person might have more than one, even though that was not really God's intent. But Solomon had 700 wives and he had 300 concubines. And the way you count that is that concubines are sort of like, well, they're essentially wives you have, but their children are not allowed to inherit anything from the father. So essentially, he had 1,000 wives, and it seems like most, if not all of these, were foreign women. At least the ones who had the most influence on him were foreign women. And first you say, wait, is that a bad thing? Like if I'm from Canada and I marry someone from Mexico, that's a foreign woman and I shouldn't do that? That's not what it's talking about here. What it's meaning is that he is marrying women who are outside the faith, meaning ones who do not follow the real God. And that's where the problem is, because they have an influence on him, so it changes the way he acts. Plus, he becomes tolerant of the kind of religious ceremonies and beliefs that they have, plus what they pass along to the children they have for him. So this is a big struggle for him, and he loses. What we find is that these wives of his want him to set up someplace for them to worship their gods. You see, they don't give up their beliefs for him, but he gives up his beliefs for them. So he builds these places for them. Well, the people in the country see, oh, it must be okay if the king's doing this and he's allowing this. And especially with a lot of these foreign gods, there were things that people were allowed to do or required to do that God said, this is just plain evil. These are bad things, and these people do this. They go against the things that God has instructed. So some of the promises that God gave to Solomon at the beginning of his reign, God says, okay, you're going to do that. You're not going to follow me. Then these blessings that I've been giving to you, you're going to lose. So whereas in the beginning, Solomon had things pretty quiet on his borders, meaning no wars with other countries, these men start being raised up in order to cause him trouble. They start leading rebellions. In fact, there's a rebellion that gets led within his own country, but some of that comes a little bit later. Uh, God has decided that he is going to tear the kingdom away from Solomon, but he's not going to do it in Solomon's lifetime. And you think, well, then Solomon's not punished. Yes, he is, because anytime a person is living into old age, and Solomon was pretty old by the time he died, one of the comforts is thinking that, okay, my family's going to live on without me and they will be blessed and they will be able to prosper and do well. And God's telling him that's not going to happen. All of these bad things are going to happen. And in fact, God sends one of his prophets to a fellow named Jeroboam. And the prophet has a brand new cloak on, and he tears the cloak into 12 pieces right there in front of Jeroboam. Well, that's going to get his attention because you just did not tear clothing like that, because clothing was hard to come by and it was expensive. Well, the prophet tears it into 12 pieces. He gives Jeroboam 10 of them and says, God's going to make you king of Israel. and he's reserving Judah for himself. And you're going, okay, but there are 12 tribes. So what's this 10 and 1? Where's the other one he's talking about? Well, the tribe of Benjamin came along as a package deal with the tribe of Judah. Part of it being that Benjamin was small and it was pretty much surrounded by Judah. So whatever Judah decided, Benjamin kind of had to go along with. And another is that Benjamin was being seen as connected to Jerusalem, and the kingdom that was going to be known as Judah from then on would still be centered in Jerusalem, and God had his temple there. And so that's kind of how that worked. All right, well, Jeroboam apparently did not keep this to himself, or the prophet didn't, because word got back to Solomon that, hey, this Jeroboam guy who's been in charge of a lot of your laborers, God's going to make him king. Well, Solomon decides, I'm going to kill this guy, without thinking that, wait a second, if this guy has been picked by God, why do you think you're going to be able to kill him? Well, still, Jeroboam says, I'm getting out of here. He goes to Egypt. See now, the first notable wife of Solomon was the daughter of Pharaoh, but now Pharaoh, whoever he might be at this time, has decided, oh, okay, I'm going to protect Jeroboam. I'm not going to hand him back over to Solomon. So you see that this marrying for political alliances in order to make friends with the countries around you, if you're doing that against God's wishes, it's not going to work out for you. And that's kind of what happens here. So Solomon dies. Jeroboam hears about that. He heads back to the people of the 10 tribes, and they go to meet up with the new king. Now, this guy's named Rehoboam, which is really confusing because it's so close to Jeroboam. Rehoboam is Solomon's son, and by the way, Rehoboam's mother was an Ammonite, meaning she was not an Israelite, meaning she had her allegiances to a god other than the real God. So Rehoboam's coming into this already with one arm tied behind his back. And the 10 tribes of Israel that are outside of Judah say, look, your dad was pretty rough on us. By the end of his reign, he was taxing us. He was having us build all kinds of stuff, and we want some relief from this. And Rehoboam says, well, give me 3 days to think about it, and I'll talk to you then. Okay, that was kind of a good idea. You don't make a hasty decision. And he goes and talks to his dad's advisors and asks them, okay, what should I do? And they said, look, your dad was pretty rough on these people. So the best thing you can do is lower their taxes, show them that you care for them and are trying to take care of them, and they'll be loyal to you. Well, Rehoboam doesn't like that answer. So he goes to his friends who grew up with him. And I won't get as graphic as what ends up happening in all of this, but his friends advise him to say that, I'm going to be tougher than my dad on you, whether you like it or not. That's pretty much what he tells the people of Israel 3 days later. And they suddenly decide, hey, wait a second. We can just leave and have our own country. And so that's what they do, and they pick Jeroboam to be their king. And a couple of things happen in all of this. One is that Rehoboam immediately calls up his army. He's got a sizable army. He's going to go to war to stop this rebellion. And prophet shows up and says, God says, don't do this. Okay. Rehoboam shows some common sense and decides, okay, we're going to let them go, even though they're going to be a lot of battles between these two countries. He's not going to try to take them over and bring them back into the fold. Now, meanwhile, you go over to Jeroboam, and this guy you would think would be a great king because he has been in charge of people. The people like him, and he seems to be on a steady course, and he's had a prophet talk to him. In fact, that prophet had also told him that here's what God says: you follow him, and I will bless you, and you will have a strong kingdom, and it will last. Well, one of the first things Jeroboam does says, you know, people here will continue to go to Jerusalem to worship, and so they'll end up going back and joining with Judah. Now, we can't have that. So, what he had done, he had a couple of golden calves constructed, had 2 worship centers set up in the country. Now, you realize all of this stuff is directly against what God wanted. And these worship centers, one is in the south, so that anyone that would head toward Jerusalem would pass by this one first, and he put one in the north. So his people will have a place to go. And he also expanded the worship of these other gods that the people around them had been doing, and even that Solomon had allowed down in Judah. And so, that's pretty much it. Israel has now started on a course where from then on, every one of their kings is going to be bad. In fact, a lot of the godly people left Israel. Uh, the Levites, for sure, most of them saw that Jeroboam is appointing people to be priests who aren't allowed to be priests, so most of them leave. And then people who were following God, who were in the 10 tribes, moved down to Judah, leaving behind all of the land that was theirs to own. Said they don't want any part of this. So Rehoboam eventually starts to come around, and he does not ever turn completely back to God in all of this. But he is humbled when Egypt attacks. Remember Egypt, who's supposed to be an ally? A pharaoh named Shishak attacks and takes a lot of his cities, and Rehoboam pays him off with treasures from the temple. In fact, if you watch the movie Raiders of the Lost Ark, it's speculated that that's when the Ark of the Covenant disappeared, when Shishak came in. Not so sure how accurate that is, but that's to give you a little bit of a tie-in. Okay, so what we have in this lesson is kind of a downer because everything seems to be going bad, but we do see that God will bless people. God will bless people even when it's not known whether or not they will obey him. But those blessings will not continue for those who disobey him. And no matter how powerful they are or what position they hold, bad things can happen when you decide, I'm just not going to follow God. Okay, with that, the tie today, I want to show goofy because Jeroboam is probably the most goofy person in the Bible who had these promises from God, and he just turned his back on all of them. And it leads to the destruction of many people and a lot of bad things that come down the line. But there are still people who follow God. We saw that with the ones who left Israel and went back to Judah. So there is still hope in all of this, and we will see how that works out in future lessons. For that, I'm going to let you go and want you to have a good day. Bye.